I first fell in love with Vincent van Gogh not at all because of his paintings, but because of his letters. As a matter of fact, I wasn't quite sure I really liked a lot of his paintings. I mean, I loved the sunflowers and the paintings of old shoes. Who wouldn't love those? But the potato eaters, that's like a painting only a mother could love. I first encountered Vincent's letters in a seminar I took at Barnard with Barbara Novak on artists' writings. And I was immediately smitten with this consciousness, with this intellect, with this utterly human person who revealed himself with such intimacy. He was so knowledgeable, so well-read. You know, he spoke 3 languages. He read everything. He adored Dickens, Balzac, Harriet Beecher Stowe. He was crazy about Uncle Tom's Cabin, for instance. He looked at everything. He lists hundreds and hundreds of artists and paintings that he looked at in his lifetime. But I think the thing that struck me most, and remember, I was in my early 20s at the time, and Vincent was in his 20s and early 30s at the time. And what struck me was here was this young man who was struggling so hard to find himself, to understand what his life was about, to find out what his virtue was. And most importantly, the thing that he repeats over and over again is, how can I be of use in the world? He'll say this over and over again. And he tried so many different things. You might not know that at first he wanted to be a minister. He thought he was going to start out being a holy man. He tried being a teacher. He worked in a bookstore. He became a lay evangelist and only eventually decided to be an artist. But the whole time, he's thinking about, how can I be of use? And I think if you look at his family tree, you'll understand a lot about his personal conflicts. And the family tree is divided into 2 professions. Half of his relatives were clergymen of some kind, and the other half were art dealers. You know, we think of Vincent as being this isolated genius, which he was, but in point of fact, he was connected into the sort of most advanced art circles in Europe at the time. But so he had this sort of heavy moral sense to his life and to figure out what it was about. When you read his letters, you sense an intimacy that's just breathtaking. You feel like you are sitting right beside him and that you're in his head. It's like when you read the poetry of Rilke, you feel as if Rilke's whispering the words into your ear. And you get this same sense from reading Van Gogh's letters. This is a typical letter page, and you can see that on many of his letters, he made tiny little sketches of the paintings he was working on so he could show Theo what he was doing. And many of the sketches and many of the letters have very, very detailed color information, you know, because of course he's doing this in black and white and he wants Theo to understand what the colors are. About 2/3 of the letters are written in Dutch, about 1/3 in French, and there's a smattering of letters in English. So for me, there are 5 distinct Vincents. The first one that we're all familiar with is the mythical Vincent. There he is. This is the one we all know, that many people know. People who don't really know him at least know this, that he's the mad, obsessed genius. The French refer to him as fou, crazy, right? He was the first cutter, and he was a suicide, supposedly. That's being challenged at the moment. But that's a very important thing, because in our minds, he gave his life for his art. That's part of the myth. And he obsesses the 20th century consciousness of us the way Goethe's Werther, obsessed the 18th century European consciousness. So this myth goes from kind of the ridiculous like this to the sublime. This is a scene, a still shot from an amazing movie by Kurosawa. And it's his last movie, or one of his last movies, called Dreams. And it's made up of a number of dream sequences. And in this sequence, a young Japanese art student, who of course is a stand-in for Kurosawa himself, is searching for help. He's looking for a master, for a mentor, for a sensei. And he fixes on Vincent van Gogh. And he travels through time and tracks him down in the south of France painting. And he meets Van Gogh and he starts to ask him questions and says he wants to be an artist. And Vincent says to him, well, what are you standing around here asking me questions for? You should be painting. And he trudges off. And so the art student wants to hear more from him. So he takes off after him, but he can't find him. And in the next 10 minutes, you see Kurosawa walking through one Van Gogh painting after another. So metaphorically, he's trying to find this man behind the art. It's an amazing, amazing sequence. Then there's Vincent the Man, to the best that we can understand him, as well as you can understand who anybody is. Vincent was passionate. If anything, he was passionate. He was capable of tremendous joy and appreciation. The number of things he lists that he loves is just incredible. He was also an amazingly difficult person. He was prickly. He couldn't stand criticism. He had a colleague at one of the art studios he went to who said he did not know what submission was. I think he had a very stern father, and he had a kind of an authority complex his whole life. He also was what psychologists call a replacement child. In other words, his mother had a baby boy named Vincent a year before him who died very early on in infancy. And Vincent, our Vincent, replaced this child. One of the problems is because the father was a clergyman, they lived in the church house, and that meant that the baby was buried in the backyard. And apparently the mother would take Vincent every day to look at the grave of his dead brother. And of course, the dead Vincent is perfect. You know, he doesn't scream, he doesn't cry, he doesn't wet his diapers. And of course, our Vincent couldn't possibly live up to this kind of reputation. The letters, the body of the letters describe this family saga that to me is just so interesting and so moving. Their struggle to stay connected, the differences, the reconciliations, all of these things. I remember that when I first started to read the letters, in my 20s, I was all about Vincent. I was like, yeah, go Vincent. You know, you've got to find yourself. You've got to find your bliss. And now in my 60s, I read the letters, and all I can think of is, oh my God, his poor parents. What they went through with him. And, you know, there were some terrible conflicts, but what was amazing to me was how they always held it together as a family. It was an incredible thing. But he was very difficult. As the saying goes, everybody wants a Van Gogh in their living room, but nobody wants Van Gogh in their living room. Adam Gopnik put it wonderfully. He wrote, "Lovable as he is on the page, we forget how exhausting he must have been to live with. A man without a stop or even a pause button on his console. You couldn't turn down the volume. All you could do was pull the plug." Vincent started to think of himself as a peasant. This was a very important idea to him. And this pair of shoes, this beautiful painting of shoes, his shoes, reinforces that idea. It's really a self-portrait, right? He wants you to feel the man who wore these shoes, the man who did physical labor. Every little bump and crease in those shoes conforms to his feet. And he's never going to throw these shoes away. Look at the number of brads and tacks in the bottom of those shoes holding them together. So this part of his identity was very, very important. By way of contrast, just for instance, look at this pair of shoes. This is a Wayne Thiebaud, who we had talk here earlier this year. And this is not the shoes of a peasant. Okay, this is the shoes of a fashionable man who, you know, will throw them away the second they're not looking so great. Then there's the Vincent of the Paintings. The paintings are spontaneous, impulsive, expressive. They're all about the mark. They're almost like early action paintings. He talks again and again about painting quick as lightning. That's an expression he uses over and over again. He says, with long and continuous practice, it, meaning this perspective frame he built, enables one to draw quick as lightning, and once the drawing is established, to paint quick as lightning also. We're going to look at a painting in a minute, the Arlésienne, the portrait of the woman, which he says was slashed on the canvas in an hour. So you have to remember that in Arles, at the end of his life, he was painting 2, sometimes 3 canvases a day. Here is the Potato Eaters. I find this painting particularly hard to like. It's very dark and ungainly. The figures are very awkward, and it has a pervasive clumsiness that I find sort of thwarts any attempts that I have at empathy. He stayed in this clumsy phase for quite a long time, and sometimes with much better results. Here's a landscape that he did, and you know, his earlier Dutch landscapes are quite dark. His color exploded, obviously, when he went to the south of France. He says something amazing about this painting, and it's one of the most sort of archaic responses to painting I can imagine. He says, while painting it, I said to myself, I must not go away before there is something of an autumn evening air about it, something mysterious, something serious. But as this effect does not stay, I needed to paint quickly. The figures were painted in at once with a few strong strokes with a firm brush. It struck me how firmly those little stems were rooted in the ground, and I began on them with a brush. But because the base was already so clotted, a brush stroke was lost in it. So I squeezed the roots and the trunks in from the tube and modeled it a little with a brush. Are you listening to this? He picks up his paint tube and squeezes the paint directly out of the tube onto the tree. I mean, a trained painter wouldn't do anything like that, right? He or she would change the value or the color relationship or firm up the edge or do something like that. But it's a very primitive kind of response to just say, well, more paint will solve the problem, right? It's the opposite of a sophisticated way of painting. Then there's Van Gogh of the drawings. And the drawings are almost a complete opposite. The drawings are studied, they're patient, they're systematic. You see him forging a new vocabulary of drawing, turning things into dots, dashes, squiggles, small lines, large lines, curved lines, everything. And he goes about it, again, very, very systematically. A drawing like this had to take a certain amount of time. And this doesn't even begin to be one of the most complicated of his drawings. When I look at this drawing, I feel like I can hear him scratching away at the paper, bent over his board, using a reed pen, which he cut from the riverbank himself and molded into a pen. Vincent, like we were saying, was very difficult, and it set up a real problem for him, which was he knew he needed help, he knew he needed art instruction, but he couldn't get along with anybody. Someone would start to teach him, and at first he'd listen, and then he figured he knew better than the other person, and he was quite recalcitrant as a student. So the solution was this. Charles Bargue, along with Jean-Léon Gérôme, published one of the most popular and great how-to-do-it drawing manuals of the 19th century, probably of all time. And this solved the problem perfectly, because Vincent got instruction, but he didn't have any person to fight with. He found Bargue absolutely essential. He said at one point, and this could read like a ad copy for the book, he says, "Careful study and the constant and repeated copying of Bargue's exercises have given me an insight into figure drawing. I have learned to measure and to see and to look for the broad outlines, so that, thank God, what seemed utterly impossible to me before is gradually becoming possible now. I no longer stand as helpless before nature as I used to." It's like the Google review you really want, right? It had about 200 loose leaf pages, which meant you could take them out, right? So it was easier to copy. It was set up into 3 sections. One was doing, parts of plaster cast. One was copying old master drawings. And he talks repeatedly about copying Holbein drawings. And part of it were copying full male figures. And by the way, the book was so prevalent, even Picasso used it in the Barcelona Academy. Here's a typical page from Bargue. This is a little into the book. It's not the easiest. But I always had trouble figuring out Bargue. He'd say, well, you start with that simple line drawing, and then he'd show you how to shade it. And I'm like, but wait, that's hard to do that simple line drawing. That block in. How do you do that? So anyway, he says, "I am still at work on Bargue's Cours de Dessin and plan to finish it before undertaking anything else, since day by day it exercises and strengthens both my hand and my mind. You can see then that I am working like mad, but for the moment it isn't giving very heartening results. But I have hope that these thorns will bear white flowers in their time, and that this apparently sterile struggle is nothing other than a labor of giving birth, first pain and the joy afterwards." And many of his metaphors have to do with natural processes of birth, growth, decay, the seasons, flowers, the weather, things like that. And then finally, there's Vincent of the letters. And again, he's one of the most thoughtful, intelligent, sensitive men you will ever encounter on the page. I feel that the body of his letters is one of the great literary achievements of the 19th century and holds up with all the great novelists. Again, it's a saga of a family over 3 generations and all its travails. It's a portrait of a time and a place, of a profession in crisis, trying to be an artist. It really is an amazing thing. He read everything, he looked at everything, he had an utter faith in art, which comes through all the time. He was also obsessive, manipulative. You could see him trying to engage Theo's help in arguments with his parents that don't, come across in a very complimentary way. He's so human. His thoughts change over time, and it's wonderful to me to see them change. He's not consistent. You know what Thoreau said about consistency? It's the hobgoblin of the petty mind. He was anything but consistent. So for instance, he loved the author Jules Michelet, who wrote a very famous history of the French Revolution. Also wrote a couple of books on women and love, and those are the ones that Vincent read. And he said about Michelet, he says to Theo, "I am glad you have read Michelet and that you understand him so well. Such a book teaches us that there is much more in love than people generally suppose. As for me, I could not do without Michelet for anything in the world. It is true that the Bible is eternal." Oh my God, he's referencing Michelet to the Bible, "and everlasting. But Michelet gives such very practical and clear hints, so directly applicable to this hurried and feverish modern life, that we cannot do without him." And then about a year later, he writes to Theo, "I am going to destroy all my books by Michelet, and I wish you would do the same." This letter was written in English. It's wonderful. You can read at the top there. "I heard Rodin had a beautiful head in the salon. I have been to the seaside for a week, and very likely I am going thither again. Flat shore sands, fine figures there, like Cimabue, straight, stylish. I am working on a sower." So he often compared things that he saw to painters, so Theo would know what he was talking about. He saw life through art. He also has these little sketches. He's working on a sower, so he wants Theo to see that. There are about 820, 840, I've read different accounts, letters. About 2/3 of them were to his brother Theo. Other recipients were fellow artists like Anton von Rappard, Paul Gauguin, Émile Bernard, and a bunch to his sister, Wilhelmine, who seems to be the only other relative that he wrote to. Vincent was a very, very prolific writer. He sometimes write 2-3 letters a day also. Sometimes he went much longer without writing. So he was a prolific writer, and Theo was a hoarder. So this worked out very well for posterity. One of the problems is Vincent, on the other hand, was not a hoarder. Vincent would get into trouble someplace and he'd have to pull up his stakes, and he would leave everything. Letters, personal effects, even paintings. I mean, the sheer number of paintings that we have of his is probably the tip of the iceberg, because he'd run and he'd leave paintings with people. Or he didn't have money for the rent and he'd say, "Here, take these 6 paintings." You know, who knows how the landlord felt about that. But it leaves us with a situation where the letters seem particularly one-sided. In other words, we know all about what Vincent is thinking, but we don't always know what Theo is thinking. We can kind of guess and put the conversation together. There are a handful of letters that survived by Theo, and I was amazed to read some of them. Remember, Vincent's 4 years older, and there's one that Vincent writes when he's 27, Theo's 24. You gather as you piece it together that Theo had not sent him any money for a month. And Vincent writes him back saying, kind of, "What gives? Where's my money?" And Theo eventually writes, "I'm going to send you your money, but I got to tell you, I'm really mad at you because I can't believe you spoke to Mom and Dad that way. And I know you have your needs and I know it's important, but you can't trample our parents, and I'm really embarrassed that you behaved like such a child." And it's amazing that the younger brother, who idolized the older brother, would kind of have the backbone to stand up and talk to him this way. I wish there were more of Theo's letters so we could really understand it. So for me, the letters really served a number of purposes. First and foremost, they were a lifeline to Theo, an external reality. Remember, Vincent was traveling all the time. There were a handful of times he had to go back to his family home, right? what is it that Robert Frost said in The Death of the Hired Man? Home is where you go and they have to take you in. And that's kind of what happened with Vincent. There was a period of several months towards the end of his life where he actually lived with Theo in Paris in an apartment, and you can imagine what that was like. And there were no letters. Obviously, they were living together. They didn't need to communicate via letter. So this idea of being a lifeline to external reality is very, very important. And it says to me why the paintings of Roulin, the postman, were so prolific. The postman was an incredibly essential figure for him. He brought the letters and connected Vincent to his family. So he painted Roulin's children, his grandchildren. He was very involved in that family. The letters were also a kind of a journal that spoke to his internal reality and how he felt about the various members of his family, about all of his love objects, friends, lovers, things like that. They were a set of documents that allowed him to work out his aesthetic theories. And he had a very analytic side. He thought a lot about painting and drawing in the abstract and art and how he fit in with what everybody else did. And you can see him sort of putting together his ideas block by block by block. It really is amazing. And lastly, at least lastly for me, the most fascinating part is they document his paintings and drawings in progress. In other words, they're like a blow-by-blow account of what he's working on and what he's thinking when he's doing it. So we all know this painting of the bedroom, and you saw a little sketch of it in the first slide. He writes to Theo, "Another canvas of size 30. This time, it's just simply my bedroom. Only here, color is to do everything, is to be suggestive here of rest or of sleep in general. In a word, to look at the picture ought to rest the brain, or rather the imagination." Remember, Matisse said that his painting should be for the eye what a comfortable armchair is for a man who uses his body all day. In another letter, he says, "The walls are pale violet, the floor is of red tiles, the wood of the bed and chairs is the yellow of fresh butter, the sheets and pillows very light lemon green, the coverlet scarlet, and that is all." And remember, he's giving him all this color information because he can't see it in a sketch. "There is nothing in this room with closed shutters. The broad lines of the furniture must again express inviolable rest. This, by way of revenge for the enforced rest I have been obliged to take because of one of his mental episodes." So he's giving us an insight into some of the motivations of this painting. The shadows and the thrown shadows, by which he means the cast shadows, are suppressed. It is colored in free flat tones like Japanese prints. So you realize there are no cast shadows in here. Where are the shadows under the bed and under the chairs and the table? They're not there. It lightens the whole thing and freshens it. And again, there's all that color information. So Theo had to send. Every once in a while, he'll take one of those sketches and put in some watercolor so he can see it that way. Here's the night cafe. And he says, "Today, I am probably going to begin the interior of the cafe where I eat by gaslight in the evening. It is what they call here a café de nuit. They are fairly frequent here, staying open all night. Night prowlers," that's all those people in the back there. You get the feeling that some of them probably couldn't even get up if they wanted to. They're getting drunk on absinthe. "Night prowlers can take refuge when they have no money to pay for lodging or are too tight to be taken in. All those things, family, native land, are perhaps more attractive in the imagination of such people as us, who pretty well do without native land or family, than they are in reality." And also, he says, very interestingly, "This picture is one of the ugliest I have done." I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. The room is blood red and dark yellow with a green billiard table in the middle. There are 4 lemon yellow lamps with a glow of orange and green. And remember, gas lamps were a relatively new thing then, so this was something very exciting. Everywhere there is a clash and contrast of the most alien greens and reds. In the figures of the little sleeping hooligans, in the empty, dreary room, in violet and blue. The blood red and yellow green of the billiard table, for instance, contrast with the soft, tender Louis XV green of the counter, on which there is a rose nosegay. The white clothes of the landlord, on vigil in a corner of this furnace, turn lemon yellow or pale luminous green. I am making a drawing of it with the tones in watercolor to send you tomorrow to give you some idea of it. And notice, he's actually not only eliminated, but accentuated the cast shadow under the billiard table. That's like surgical level lighting, right? And yet there's no cast shadows anywhere else. So you emphasize this. Something, that also gives you a very foreboding sense for me is, you all know what the line of sight is, right? So you have the railroad tracks, and the line of sight is the one line that goes straight to the horizon line. It's right about here, right? All these lines are going this way, and all those lines are that way. So here's your line of sight where you would enter, and he's put a chair there. So you feel like you would stumble over this thing if you tried to walk into it. There's a very pressing sense of anxiety in this on many levels. Here's the Arlésienne painting he was talking about. Then I have an Arlésienne at last, a figure slashed on in an hour. Background pale lemon yellow, the face gray, the clothes black, deep black. He once said there were 24 blacks. With perfectly raw Prussian blue, she is leaning on a green table and seated in an armchair of orange wood. Vincent's attitude towards religion, again, was extremely charged. He was kind of like St. Augustine in reverse, right? St. Augustine started out as a wild man. You read the Confessions and he says things like, I was wandering the streets of Babylon in a seething cauldron of lust. And he has the great remark, the plea to the Lord, where he says, "O Lord, please give me chastity and continence, but not yet." And then, of course, he becomes this ultra-ascetic saint. Vincent goes in exactly the opposite arc. He starts out trying to be a saint, trying to be a holy man. He gave away his clothes to the miners. He wanted to live the Gospels, literally. And he ends up as a raging alcoholic, cutting off his ear and presenting it to a prostitute in a brothel. So they had similar tendencies, but very different arcs. Yeats has a poem that's called The Choice or The Choosing, and it's a very short poem, and it goes, "The intellect of man must choose between perfection of the life or of the art. And if it choose the second, must forego the heavenly mansion raging in the dark." So you really have two choices if you're trying to fulfill your life, and that's to either be a saint or an artist. And if you decide to become a saint, you at least get to go to heaven. You get the heavenly mansion. If you decide to be an artist, you're left raging in the dark. And that seems to me to describe Vincent's situation very clearly. I was going to say, this is like the song Losing My Religion, but Vincent never lost his religion or his religious fervor. He merely transferred it from the Church of Christ to the Church of Art. Art became his religion, the thing that he believed in with utter faith. But to watch him, again, when he's young, the early letters are not all that interesting. right? He's only like 17 or 18 when he starts writing to Theo, and he's in one of his ultra-religious stages. He read the Bible like crazy. He's constantly quoting scripture to Theo and exhorting him to be, very good and moral. And you're going, yeah. But eventually that falls away. He becomes completely disenchanted with the church. He says, "Then, not at once, I felt that religious love die within me. A void, an infinite void came instead. Then I felt something like, 'My God, why hast thou forsaken me?'" He's quoting Christ there, "And everything became a blank. I thought, have I been deceiving myself? Oh God, there is no God." What confusion. He's talking to God about the fact that there's no God. He's obviously very conflicted. "For me, that God of the clergyman is as dead as a doornail. But does that make me an atheist? A clergyman considers me one. But you see that I love, and how could I feel love if I were not myself alive, or others were not alive? And if we are alive, there is something wondrous in that. Now call that God or human nature or whatever you like, but there is a certain something I cannot define systematically, although it is very much alive and real. And you see, for me, that something is God, or as good as God." He was sort of a pantheist, actually. And at one point, when he reaches his lowest attitude towards religion, he said, "God is everywhere except in the church." So art becomes his religion, his salvation. And in point of fact, it unites the two strains of his personality. It redeems this family conflict that he had. He could be true to both things. And he says, "In my opinion, I am often rich as Croesus, not in money, but rich because I have found in my work something to which I can devote myself heart and soul, and which gives inspiration and significance to life. Of course, my moods vary, but there is an average of serenity. I have a sure faith in art, a sure confidence that it is a powerful stream which bears a man to harbor, though he himself must do his bit too. And at all events, I think it's such a great blessing when a man has found his work that I cannot count myself among the unfortunate. I may be in certain relative great difficulties, and there may be gloomy days in my life, but I shouldn't want to be counted among the unfortunate, nor would it be correct." And you have to remember, by the time he was in his mid-30s and he died at 37, I want you to keep in mind that he did not start painting until he was 27. So that entire body of work was done in 10 years. 10 years. That's extraordinary accomplishment, right? He was a very late starter. But he did find a way to unite these two themes. Two themes that I find, there's a million things we could talk about, but two themes that I find particularly interesting are how his attitudes towards drawing and painting, which he's very conscientious about describing, change over time. This is a very early drawing, and you can see how kind of unsophisticated it is. At the time that he's doing this drawing, there was a kind of an upheaval, if not a crisis, in the attitude towards drawing, right? Drawing was always considered the hallmark of all art, right? You always drew, you learned how to draw. Here we are at the Art Students League, nulla dia sine linea, no day without a line. That is our school motto. And that perseveres to this time. But at that time, towards the middle of the 19th century, there was a real upheaval and people started to really question, did you need that much drawing? Couldn't you just start painting? And by the way, why does line have to be supreme? Couldn't color be the most important thing? So you see, with Impressionism, there are very few Impressionist drawings, hardly any. You know, they didn't draw. They went right out and started painting directly from nature. But Van Gogh was kind of a throwback. He really believed in the importance of drawing. He said, drawing is the root of everything. And he believed that very passionately. He says, there are laws of proportion, of light and shadow, of perspective, that one must know in order to be able to draw anything at all. If one lacks that knowledge, it will always remain a fruitless struggle, and one will never give birth to anything. The problem is, he was, and this is the problem with late starters. When you're a kid, you don't have the ego or the self-consciousness. You just throw yourself in and you start doing it. When you try to learn something as an adult, and you're really good at some things and you're terrible at the thing you're trying to learn, it becomes very difficult and you're very self-conscious. I realized that probably one of the most important things that I ever did as a teacher of art was that when I had my first sabbatical from the university, I decided to take piano lessons. And I was about 40, and I loved music. Everyone else in my family played the piano. They made it look really easy, and I sat down and I was horrible. I mauled my way through the Anna Magdalena notebooks. It was just horrible to listen to. And I felt like I had these 10 absolutely unruly, unmanageable sausages on the ends of my hands that didn't want to ever do anything that I wanted them to do. And I said, oh my God, this is how my drawing students feel. And it really struck me and made me much more empathetic to what they were doing. And he says, I am sending you 3 sketches which are clumsy as yet, but from which you will see, I hope, that I am gradually improving. You should take into account that it is only a short time since I started drawing, although I made sketches as a boy. Or he says, and this is such a great analysis of this turmoil in his mind. He says, in the first period of a painter's life, one unconsciously makes it very hard for oneself by a feeling of not being able to master the work, by an uncertainty as to one will ever master it, by a great ambition to make progress, by a lack of self-confidence. One cannot banish a certain feeling of agitation, and one hurries oneself, though one doesn't like being hurried. And remember, he was an art dealer since he was 16. He went into the family business. So he was surrounded by beautiful, masterful paintings. So it's like, I listened to Horowitz and I thought, oh, this is how I want to play. So he knew what great drawing was. He just couldn't do it. This cannot be helped, and it is a time which one must go through, and which in my opinion cannot and should not be otherwise. In the studies, too, one is conscious of a nervousness and a certain dryness, which is the exact opposite of the calm, broad touch one strives for. And yet it doesn't work well if one applies oneself too much to acquiring that broad touch, right? You earn that through mastery. That's what they used to call sprezzatura. Sprezzatura was that ease that comes from making it look easy. Vincent made it look hard at the beginning, right? This gives one a feeling of nervous unrest and agitation, and one feels an oppression as on summer days before a thunderstorm. I had that feeling again just now, and when I have it, I change my work just to make a new start. That trouble one has at the beginning sometimes gives an awkwardness to the studies. But I do not take this as a discouragement, because I have noticed it in myself as well as in others who afterwards just slowly got rid of it. And I believe that sometimes one keeps that painful way of working one's whole life, but not always with so little result as at the beginning. He felt, here's another drawing, early drawing, and again, very awkward. Very clumsy. Although one thing that's very telling about this drawing is he really started drawing in earnest when he went to the Borinage, which was an area of Belgium where the poorest of the poor, the coal miners, were. It would be like going into the heart of Appalachia here. And he worked as a lay minister, and that did not work out well. He basically was fired. But he started to look at the miners and to have this immense sympathy with them, and he started drawing them. And I've always felt as a teacher, I'll tell students that you make the most progress when you find your subject matter. When there's something that you really want to express and you want to do, you'll figure out a way to do it. Without that goal, it's going to be hard to make progress. But he felt this incredible pressure to get better, even though he knew that progress came at its own pace, right? I certainly was glad that you yourself found progress in the sketches I sent you. I certainly hope to work very hard so that neither you nor Mr. Terstig need reverse that favorable opinion. I will try hard not to disappoint you in this. So this man, Mr. Terstig, was one of the owners of Goupil and Company, the big gallery that had offices in Paris and London and Den Haag. He was a friend and colleague of Theo's. He actually was Vincent's boss for a while when he was a teenager. And Theo set it up so that Vincent could go to him when he needed him. And at first he went to him for advice. Occasionally he went to him for money. So he sort of looked up to Mr. Terstig. But he got into a series of terrible fights with Terstig. And you see at least Vincent's side of the story from the letters. Terstig was encouraging Vincent to try to make things that were saleable, right? Which meant that he had to get involved with color and do colored watercolors. And Vincent said, I'm not ready. My drawing isn't strong enough. I need to work on drawing. What I need to do is do more exercises from Charles Bargue. Now, of course, those things are not saleable at all. They're exercises. So Vincent was really torn by desperately wanting to make money as a professional illustrator, and at the same time knowing he wasn't ready. And this tension was very, very hard for him to navigate. So he gets into a real fight with Terstig, who's encouraging him to make these saleable watercolors. And he writes, perhaps you will find it rather harsh what I wrote you about Terstig, but I cannot take it back. It must be told him straight out, or else it does not penetrate his sheathing. He has considered me for years a kind of dreamer and duffer. He still considers me so, and even says about my drawing, quote, that is a kind of narcotic which you take in order not to feel the pain it costs you not to be able to make watercolors. Well, it is all very well to say this, but thoughtless, superficial, and not to the point. The principal reason for my not being able to make watercolors is that I must draw still more seriously, paying more attention to the proportions and the perspective. He must see now, once and for all, that I take things seriously and will not let myself be forced to produce work that does not show my own character. It is especially in my last drawings and studies, which Terstig condemned, that my own character is beginning to show. Perhaps I could succeed even now in making a watercolor that would sell if one tried very hard, but that would be forcing watercolors in a hothouse. Terstig and you must wait for the natural season, which has not arrived yet. Since Terstig's visit, I have made a drawing of a boy from the orphanage, blacking shoes. It may be this is done by a hand that does not quite obey my will, but still, the type of the boy is there. And though my hand may be unruly, that hand will learn to do what my head wishes. So you see him almost crucified in this conflict. So how did he get better? I mean, he got better by copying Bargue. And it's interesting that his requests for Bargue actually frame his career. In 1880, he started asking Theo to send him the pages from Bargue, and he worked from them. And then, again, at the very end of his life, in 1890, he asked again for Theo to send him the Bargue so he could work on those exercises. But another thing that he did was he copied. And this was always the tried and true way of learning your art, was to copy the masters. And for Vincent, the greatest master of all was Millet. He adored Millet because he wasn't super sophisticated. He wasn't like a Degas. He didn't have that angelic line. But more importantly, he painted peasants. He painted the rural life. And Vincent thought that that was the finest, highest calling you could have. So his drawings got better by working from bark and from copying. He says about Millet, and by the way, people, not me, who have studied these letters in such depth have actually recorded the number of references to different artists, and apparently Millet is the top. There's something like 170 references to Millet in the letters. Second is a Dutch artist named Anton Mauve, who was a very fine Dutch realist. But the reason there's so many references to Mauve is that he actually was a family relative. So he talked to Mauve a lot about painting problems, and he actually went to Den Haag and worked in Mauve's studio for a couple of months until they got into such a fight that Mauve kicked him out, which created another seismic family drama, which is recorded in there. Third was Rembrandt, and fourth was Delacroix. I started writing down the names in the cover of my book of all the artists that he mentioned, and I stopped at 100. He says, up to Millet and Jules Breton, however, there was always, in my opinion, progress, but to surpass these two, don't even mention it. Their genius may be equaled in former, present, or later times, but to surpass it is not possible. In that high range, there is an equality of genius, but higher than the top of the mountain, one cannot climb. Now, in the realm of art, the summit has been reached. Certainly, we shall see beautiful things in the years to come, but anything more sublime than we have seen already, no. And you can see that Vincent worked from Millet all his life. The sower obviously comes from a Millet sower. He copied many Millet motifs over and over again. Eventually, his drawings do get better. They get really strong and powerful. And I think they became that way because he realized that he was never going to be a super polished, sophisticated draftsman. And then he realized, you know what? I don't even want to be a super polished, sophisticated draftsman. Again, compare him to Degas. It's sort of apples and oranges. He said, well, my drawings may be a little crude, but they're heartfelt. They're just saturated in emotion, and that this crudeness was in fact a strength that he didn't want to get rid of. And that strength was his lack of training. That actually was a plus. These sometimes make me think of Cathay Colvitts. So he began to develop this aesthetic of heartfelt crudeness that avoided polish and finish at all costs. He writes, tell Serret that I should be desperate if my figures were correct. Tell him that I do not want them to be academically correct. Tell him, I mean, that if one photographs a digger, he certainly would not be digging then. In other words, he'd be frozen in midair, right? Tell him that for me, Millet and Lermette are the real artists for the very reason that they do not paint things as they are, traced in a dry analytic way, but as they, Millet, Lermette, feel them. The emphasis comes not on seeing, but feeling all of a sudden. Tell him that my great longing is to learn to make those very incorrectnesses, those deviations, remodelings, changes of reality, so that they may become, yes, untruth if you like, but more true than the literal truth. And I kept thinking about this piece that I love, this Picasso ironer, seamstress. Anatomically, not possible, right? But look at that feeling of weight, of weariness, of exertion, all from that impossible anatomical raised shoulder, right? Or he talks about the Hokusai, great wave. Again, he loved Japanese prints. And he says, Hokusai rings the same cry from you, but he does it by his line, his drawing, as you say in your letter. Quote, this is Theo. The waves are claws, and the ship is caught in them. You feel it. Well, if you make the color exact or the drawing exact, it won't give you a sensation like that. So again, he went and developed this identity as a peasant, a workman who crafts things, right? He says, I assure you, if my constitution had not become in all winds and weather like that of a peasant, I should not be able to stand it. Or he says, we must work as much and with as few pretensions as a peasant if we want to last. You should work as if you were making a pair of shoes. I read that and I think, oh my God, Alberti is rolling over in his grave. Artists spent 400 years trying to prove that they were intellectuals and that they were on the level with the other liberal arts and they weren't just craftsmen. And to go back to comparing yourself to a shoemaker is anathema, sort of to the arc of Western artists. He says about the potato eaters, I have tried to emphasize that these people, eating their potatoes in the lamplight, have dug the earth with those very hands they put in the dish, and so it speaks of manual labor and how they have honestly earned their food. Or, to draw a peasant figure in action, I repeat, that's an essentially modern image, the very heart of modern art, something neither the Greeks nor the Renaissance nor the old Dutch school have done. And yes, if you think about it, he's not painting gods, he's not painting aristocratic portraits, he's not painting heroes, he's painting peasants. It never was a subject in art before. One of the problems, again, was that early on he introduced this sort of fatal flaw into his thinking, which was that he wanted to learn how to draw and progress, but he wanted to make money by it. Those two things rarely go together. And he kind of got crucified in between those two ambitions, insisting from the very start that he be able to make a living from his art. He felt he deserved that. I mean, any of us who feel that we deserve to make a living from our art are really in trouble, because the reality is otherwise. And he says, only if I study drawing thus seriously and thoroughly, always trying to portray truly what I see, shall I arrive. And then, notwithstanding the inevitable expenses, I shall make a living by it. Or, in this way, I am learning a handicraft, and though it will certainly not make me rich, I will at any rate earn my 100 francs a month, which is the least one needs to live on, as soon as I become a better draftsman and get some regular work. What I think is amazing is Van Gogh's ambition was not to become one of the seminal figures of modern art. It was to be a commercial illustrator. That's what he really hoped to be, at least at the very beginning. For my part, I think that it is absolutely my duty to try to make money by my work. So I see my work very clearly before me. Oh, if only every artist had something to live on and to work on. But as that is not so, I want to produce a lot and with a consuming drive. And perhaps the time will come when we can extend our business and be more help to others. So this is a problem that he had. He can't take care of himself, and he already wants to help other people. He was kind of a utopianist. He believed in this community of artists, and that's why he invited Gauguin to come to Arles with him. He wanted to have these artist communities, right? This is for many a painter also something unbearable, or at least almost unbearable. One wants to be an honest man, one is so, one works as hard as a slave, but still one cannot make both ends meet. One must give up the work, there is no chance of carrying it out without spending more on it than one gets back for it. One gets a feeling of guilt, of shortcoming, of not keeping one's promises. One is not honest as one would like to be if the work were paid for at its natural, reasonable price. One is afraid of making friends. One is afraid of moving, like one of the old lepers. One would like to call from afar to the people, "Don't come too near me, for intercourse with me brings you sorrow and loss." With all that great load of care on one's heart, one must set to work with a calm, everyday face, without moving a muscle, live one's ordinary life, get along with the models, with the man who comes for the rent, with everybody, in fact. With a cool head, one must keep one hand on the rudder to continue the work, and with the other try to do no harm to others. And then storms arise, things one had not foreseen. One doesn't know what to do, and one has a feeling that one may strike a rock at any moment. So he's just torn, and he's getting money from Theo all along. Actually, he thought at first that he was getting money from his father, and it turned out that it was Theo who was sending him the money. And so he's desperate to try to make himself worthy, but he can't. We know he didn't sell a painting in his lifetime, right? The other major issue, artistic issue again, is his attitude towards color. And to see this change throughout the letters is really amazing. So early on, he started to very seriously and assiduously work from nature. And he felt that you sat in front of nature and you tried to transcribe it, right? He said, "I think the surest way, which cannot fail, is to work from nature faithfully and energetically. Feeling and love for nature sooner or later find a response from people who are interested in art. It is the painter's duty to be entirely absorbed by nature and to use all his intelligence to express sentiment in his work so that it becomes intelligible to other people. To work for the market is, in my opinion, not exactly the right way, but on the contrary, involves deceiving the amateurs. And true painters have not done so. Rather, the sympathy they received sooner or later came from their sincerity." And he says, "The colorist is he who, seeing a color in nature, knows at once how to analyze it and can say, for instance, that green-gray is yellow with black and blue, etc., etc." However, his attitude towards color starts to change. And he says at one point, "It isn't possible to get values and color together." I'm not sure I agree with that, but that's what he says. Possible to get values and color together. You can't be at the pole and the equator at the same time. You must choose your line, as I hope to do, and it will probably be color. So he starts to revise his idea that drawing is the root of everything and start to think that color was perhaps his most expressive tool. And so eventually he moves from saying you must look carefully and study nature and transcribe it to say, well, wait a second, maybe you can do things more expressively that deviate from nature. And he says, "It is only that what I am learning in Paris is leaving me, and that I shall return to the ideas I had in the country before I knew the Impressionists. And I should not be surprised if the Impressionists soon find fault with my way of working, for it has been fertilized by the ideas of Delacroix rather than by theirs. Because instead of trying to reproduce exactly what I have before my eyes, I use color more arbitrarily so as to express myself forcibly." Right? So crudeness in the drawing and forcefulness via color in the paintings. Here's this wonderful portrait. I'm sorry, it's a little over pixelated there. This was the poet Bach, a friend of his. And he says, I should like to paint the portrait of an artist friend, a man who dreams great dreams, who works as the nightingale sings because it is in his nature. He'll be a fair man. I want to put into the picture my appreciation, the love that I have for him. So I paint him as he is, as faithfully as I can to begin with. But the picture is not finished yet. To finish it, I am now going to become the arbitrary colorist. I exaggerate the fairness of the hair. I get to orange tones, chromes, and pale lemon yellow. Beyond the head, instead of painting the ordinary wall of the mean room, I paint infinity, a plain background of the richest, intensest blue that I can contrive. And by this simple combination, the bright head illuminated against a rich blue background acquires a mysterious effect, like a star in the depths of an azure sky. Or he writes, I am always in hope of making a discovery there, to express the love of two lovers by a marriage of two complementary colors, their mingling and their opposition, the mysterious vibrations of kindred tones. So he's starting to think of color very abstractly. And to go back to the Night Cafe, I have tried to express the terrible passions of humanity by means of red and green. And one thing that's amazing to me is he documents this change in his attitude towards color as if he's witnessing it, like he doesn't have anything to do with it, right? Like he's just seeing what happens as it goes along. He says, while painting, I feel of late a certain power of color awaken in me, stronger and different from what I have felt till now. It may be that the nervousness of these days is linked up with a kind of revolution in my way of working, for which I have been seeking and of which I have been thinking for a long time already. And now that I let myself go a little and look more through the eyelashes, right, he's telling you to squint, instead of concentrating on the joints and analyzing the structure of things, it leads me more directly to seeing things like more adjacent, contrasting pieces of color. What a great definition of color spots, right? I wonder what it will lead to. Like he's not in the driver's seat, like he's in the passenger seat, and how it will develop. I have sometimes wondered why I was not more of a colorist, because my temperament decidedly seems to indicate it. But up until now, it developed very little. I repeat, I wonder how it will develop, but I see clearly that my last painted studies are different. So he develops this persona as an artist who's rough but honest, who's truthful rather than refined and prettied up. He describes himself as a draft horse, right? Not as a thoroughbred. He says, believe me, in things of art, the saying is true. Honesty is the best policy. Rather more study on a serious study than a kind of sheet to flatter the public. Sometimes in moments of worry, I have longed for some of that chic, but thinking it over, I say, no, let me be true to myself and in a rough manner express severe, rough, but true things. I shall not run after the amateurs or dealers. Let those who want to come to me. In due season we shall reap if we faint not. There he is quoting from the Bible. But there he is also setting up an impossible situation. I want to sell, but I'm not going to do anything for the dealers. How does that work? Another thing I ask myself is, like, why didn't Vincent get a part-time job like everybody else? It's like it never occurred to him. I mean, he was not capable of compromise in that regard. He was very, very stubborn on that footing. As well, the letters demonstrate his real lucidity about his illness. So we think that he was probably manic depressive. He might have had epilepsy, grand mal seizures, things like this, but he probably was manic depressive. And he has he's the opposite of this crazy, raving lust for life kind of guy. He was very, very lucid about what was happening to him. And this is at a time, remember, where people didn't know anything about this. And there was no lithium and all of these problems. But he had certain great realizations. First, that his illness was episodic, that it came and went. He realized that when he was in the middle of an attack, he needed help. That's a really important thing. He needed to be isolated, meaning just gotten out of the flux of life. And that he realized that most likely he would recover, that it would pass if he kind of hung in there. And most importantly, he realized that working was the key for him to stay healthy, for him to be able to paint. So he says, I have put aside the hope that it will not come back. On the contrary, we must expect that from time to time I shall have an attack. But even at those times, it would be possible to go to a nursing home or even into the town prison where there is generally a cell. There he is going to check himself into a jail so that he could be alone and he could get over it. Or he says, well, with this mental disease I have, I think of the many other artists suffering mentally, and I tell myself that this does not prevent one from exercising the painter's profession as if nothing was amiss. So he realized he could get over this. Or he says, once my bodily strength comes back, but also at the slightest grave symptom, I have already told Ray, he was the doctor at the Oral Hospital, that I would come back and put myself under the mental specialist at X or under him. Or he says, but as for considering myself as altogether sane, we must not do it. People here who are ill, like me, have told me the truth. You may be old or young, but there will always be moments when you lose your head. Oh, I do not ask you to say that there is nothing wrong with me or that there never will be. He had this absolute certainty that his work would save him on so many levels. He says, when I am at work, I feel an unlimited faith in art and that I shall succeed. But in days of physical prostration or when there are financial obstacles, I feel that faith diminishing and a doubt overwhelms me, which I try to conquer by setting to work again at once. Lastly, the letters chronicle this amazing relationship between the two brothers. Right? Theo dies within 9 months of Vincent's death. The letters document their closeness, intense closeness, their periodic estrangement and subsequent reconciliations. They chronicle Vincent's fear of abandonment. Keep in mind the timing of things, right? His first major episode came right after Theo told him he was engaged to be married. So now all of a sudden, Vincent is not going to be Theo's complete occupation or responsibility. One of his later attacks came right after Theo told him that Joanna was pregnant and they were going to have a baby. So now Vincent couldn't be the baby. I mean, these were things he didn't think consciously, but they were certainly in his mind, if not his stomach. But all along, you see him desperately trying to prove to Theo that he was a good investment, that Theo had bet on the right horse, that he wasn't throwing good money after bad. Their closeness is everywhere. He says, doubly and twice doubly, I appreciate your helping me so faithfully and in such measure. I think so often of you. I want my work to be firm, serious, manly, and that you too will get satisfaction from it as soon as possible. Or he writes, I am writing especially to tell you how thankful I am for your visit. When one lives with others and is united by a feeling of affection, One is aware of a reason for living and perceives that one is not quite worthless and superfluous, but perhaps good for something, and we need each other and make the same journey as traveling companions. But the feeling of proper self-esteem also depends very much on our relations with others. Or, write soon if you have the time, and know that you are again and again, I constantly, in my thoughts. Believe me with a handshake, your loving brother Vincent. They went through a number of very rough periods. Again, I was telling you about this letter that Theo wrote to him, and Vincent writes, now, all jesting aside, I really think it would be better if the relation between us became more friendly on both sides. If I had to believe that I were troublesome to you or to the people at home, or were in your way, or of no good to anyone, and if I should be obliged to feel like an intruder or an outcast, so that I were better off dead, and if I should have to try and keep out of your way more and more, if I thought this were really the case, a feeling of anguish would overwhelm me, and I should have to struggle against despair. But imagine looking at the recent auctions at Sotheby's or Christie's. You know, Theo definitely bet on the right horse. He sometimes had fears that Theo would desert him. He says once, now I hope that you will not be angry at my saying so, but I am rather anxious because you have not answered as yet. I do not believe that you will disapprove of my being with Christine. I do not believe that for that reason, or for the sake of appearances, or I don't know what else, you would quite desert me. But can you wonder, after what happened with Mauve and Tierstig, that I sometimes think with a certain melancholy, perhaps he will do the same? So I want to end with, and you'll have to excuse me, I just find this material very, very moving. This is Joanna Bonger, Theo's widow. This is a painting painted by Isaac Israels of her when she was 62, right before she died. She is really the unsung hero of this entire story. There would be no Vincent Van Gogh or his body of work without her. You have to imagine, she was 28 when she married Theo. She was 29 when he died, leaving her with an infant. Not only that, she was left with hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of Vincent's paintings and drawings, which had absolutely zero market value at the time, and which, from what we know, she didn't particularly like or understand at first. She knew that Theo admired them, but she got absolutely no approval from anyone else. And you could not blame her. It would have been absolutely understandable if when Theo died, she just left all the work and went home, or dumped it, cleared it out on auction, as many people told her. Just clear it out. Let someone take all of it for a couple of bucks. But she didn't do that. And the letters became her life mission, actually. She spent the rest of her life dealing and editing the letters between the two brothers. You have to realize a lot of these letters were not dated. They were thrown around in random ways, and she went through all 820 or 40 of them and said, well, this happened here, and she made a timeline, and this one came before this one, and she kind of put it all together. She also translated the letters into English. She apparently was trained in literature, so she immediately understood the value of these letters. She says, "The letters have taken a large place in my life already, since the beginning of Theo's illness. The first lonely evening which I spent in our home, after my return, I took the package of letters. I knew that in them I should find him again. Evening after evening, that was my consolation after the miserable days. It was not Vincent I was seeking, but Theo. I drank in every word. I absorbed every detail. I not only read the letters with my heart, but with my whole soul. And so it has remained all the time. I have read them and reread them until I saw the figure of Vincent clearly before me. Imagine for one moment my experience when I came back to Holland. And again, understand, she's just asking you for 1 second to understand her position. When I came back to Holland, realizing the greatness and nobility of that lonely artist's life, imagine my disappointment at the indifference which people showed when it concerned Vincent and his work. Sometimes it made me very sad. I remember how last year, on the anniversary of Vincent's death, I went out late in the evening. The wind blew, it rained, and it was pitch dark. Everywhere in the houses, I saw light and people gathered around the table, and I felt so forlorn that for the first time, I understood what Vincent must have felt in those times. When everybody turned away from him, when he felt as if there were no place on earth for him. Since that winter, when I was alone, I have not been unhappy. Sorrowful, yet always rejoicing. That was one of Vincent's expressions, which I have come to understand now." This is her as a 28-year-old. And I just want to leave you with a quote from Gray's Elegy in a Country Churchyard. He wrote, "Full many a flower is born to blush unseen and waste its sweetness on the desert air." And I just want you to think, we think that history is sort of written in stone, that because it is, it had to be that way. Yes, there's always going to be Vincent van Gogh. Well, maybe there might not have been. History actually hangs on a thread. And it could have been very, very different. We could have had a world without Vincent. And it was really because of his letters that we have it. And it was because of Joanna Bonger. Thank you very much.